On a June morning in 1860, in a large house in the Wiltshire countryside, a nursemaid woke and found a bed empty. The house was called Road Hill House. It stood alone above a village, and in it slept a family of 12, a father, a mother, 7 children, and 3 servants. It was, in every visible respect, a prosperous and respectable Victorian household. And on that morning, one of its children was gone. The doors were checked, the windows were checked, and here is the fact that turned an ordinary domestic tragedy into the most notorious case in England. The house was still locked. Every door bolted, every window fastened from the inside. Nobody had broken in, because nobody had needed to, which meant that whoever had done this had been inside the house all night and was still standing among them that morning, in a nightgown, helping to search. Scotland Yard sent the best man they had, Detective Inspector Jonathan Wiltshire, the most celebrated policeman in England. Within a fortnight, he had looked at that family, and he had named his suspect, and the reaction of the British public was not gratitude. It was fury. The press tore him apart, the case collapsed, and Jonathan Wiltshire, disbelieved, ridiculed, finished, left the force a broken man. 5 years later, the young woman he had accused walked into a church, sat down with a priest, and confessed. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if forgotten stories like this one are the reason you're here, subscribe. This is all we do. This is the Road Hill House murder. To understand what happened at Road Hill House, you have to understand the family inside it, because the whole case turns on them. The father was Samuel Kent, a sub-inspector of factories, a man of some standing and considerable ambition. He had married twice. His first wife had borne him a number of children and had died in 1852 after years of illness. Years during which, it was widely believed in the village, Samuel had already begun a relationship with the family's young governess. Barely a year after his first wife's death, he married that governess. Her name was Mary Pratt, and she became the second Mrs. Kent. So the household was, in a quiet and unspoken way, divided down the middle. There were the children of the first marriage, among them a girl named Constance, who was 16 in 1860, and her brother William. And there were the children of the second marriage, the new wife's children, who were, by every account, plainly and openly favored. The first family were the leftovers of a dead woman. The second were the future. It was not a happy house. It was a house with a wound in it, and nobody outside had the faintest idea. The youngest of the second family was a little boy of 3, named Francis Saville Kent. His family called him Saville. He was, by all accounts, a cheerful and much-loved child, the favorite of his mother, and the favorite of his father, and he slept in the nursery on the first floor, in a cot beside the bed of the nursemaid who cared for him. He was 3 years old. He is the reason we are telling this story, and it is important to say his name, because in almost every account of this case, he becomes a piece of evidence rather than a child. He was a small boy who was loved, in a house where love was distributed unevenly, and everybody knew it. On the night of the 29th of June, 1860, he was put to bed as usual. The nursemaid slept a few feet away, and at 5 o'clock the next morning she woke and looked over, and the cot was empty. The blankets had been drawn back neatly. She assumed the boy's mother had come in the night and taken him. She went back to sleep. By 7 o'clock, the household knew Saville was not with his mother, and the search began. They went through the house first, and then the grounds. And it was in the grounds, in a disused outbuilding, that he was found. This channel is not going to describe what had been done to him. It is enough to know that it was violent and deliberate, and that it was done by someone who knew that house, and knew where to go, and had the whole quiet night to do it. The local police arrived, and from the first hour, they made a mess of it. Evidence was handled and lost. The family were treated with the deference their class demanded, rather than the suspicion the facts demanded. Rooms were not sealed. Nothing was properly recorded. and the single most important piece of physical evidence in the entire case, a blood-stained nightdress, passed through the hands of the local force and vanished, and was never seen again. But the central fact could not be got around, no matter how badly the investigation was run. The house had been locked from the inside, and so the killer was one of the 12 people who had slept in it. 2 weeks after the murder, with the local police floundering and the newspapers in an uproar, the Home Office sent for Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard sent Detective Inspector Jonathan Wiltshire. Wiltshire was, at that moment, the most famous detective in England, one of the original 8 men of the Yard's first detective branch, admired by Charles Dickens, who had written about him and his colleagues with open fascination. The very idea of a detective was new. The word itself was barely 20 years old, and Wiltshire was the man who had made the public believe in it. He arrived at Road Hill House and found a crime scene 2 weeks cold, a family closed ranks against him, and a local force that had destroyed most of what he needed. He had almost nothing to work with. So he did the only thing left. He looked at the people. What Wiltshire fastened on was a piece of missing laundry. The house kept a laundry book in which every item sent out to be washed was recorded, and one of Constance Kent's nightdresses, recorded as sent and recorded as returned, had disappeared. Constance said the laundress had lost it. The laundress said no such thing, and Wiltshire, turning it over, could see the shape of it, a garment that could not be explained away, that had vanished at exactly the moment it mattered, from the room of a 16-year-old girl. He looked harder at her, and what he found was this. Constance Kent was a strange, self-contained, unhappy girl. She had run away from home once before, with her brother William, cutting off her hair, dressing in boys' clothing, and getting as far as Bath before they were caught and brought back. She hated her stepmother. She believed, with reason, that she and her siblings had been shunted aside in their own home for the children of the woman who had replaced their mother. And Wiltshire, who had spent his life reading people, looked at that girl and at that missing nightdress and reached his conclusion. On the 16th of July, 1860, he arrested Constance Kent for the murder of her half-brother. And then Victorian England did something that tells you a great deal about Victorian England. It did not thank him. It turned on him. The idea that a young lady of good family, a 16-year-old girl, gently raised, a daughter of a respectable house, could have done such a thing, was, to the public and the press of 1860, not merely wrong, but obscene. That a policeman, a man of the working class, should walk into a gentleman's home, rifle his family's laundry book, and accuse his daughter of murder was an outrage against the whole order of things. The newspapers were savage. Wiltshire was mocked as a man who had built a murder charge out of a missing nightgown. Cartoons were drawn, questions were asked in Parliament, and at the magistrate's hearing, the case fell apart exactly as you would expect a case with no physical evidence to fall apart. The nightdress was gone. There were no witnesses. There was nothing but a detective's reading of a girl's character. Constance was discharged and walked out of the court, and the crowd cheered her. Jonathan Wiltshire went back to London, a ruined man. His health broke. His reputation was gone. Within a few years, he resigned from the force he had helped to create and disappeared from public life, remembered, if he was remembered at all, as the detective who had disgraced himself by accusing an innocent girl. The case went cold, and the house emptied. Samuel Kent moved his family away from Road Hill. They could hardly have stayed. Suspicion continued to circulate, around the nursemaid, around Samuel himself, around the possibility of some sordid business in the house that had ended in a child's death. Everyone had a theory, and none of them could be proved, and the case settled into that peculiar Victorian afterlife of a crime that everyone knows about and nobody can solve. And Constance Kent was sent abroad. She went to France, to a convent school, and then returned to England, to a religious house in Brighton, an Anglican sisterhood, where she lived quietly under the care of a clergyman named Arthur Wagner. For 5 years, she prayed and she worked, and she said nothing. And then, in the spring of 1865, she asked to speak to him. On the 25th of April, 1865, Constance Kent walked into Bow Street Magistrates' Court in London, accompanied by the clergyman, and gave herself up for the murder of her half-brother. She was 21 years old. She confessed fully and calmly. She said she had taken the child from his cot in the night. She said she had done it alone, that no one else in the household had known anything about it, and that she had acted from no motive but her own resentment of her stepmother. She insisted, over and over, on that last point, that nobody else was involved, and that her father in particular knew nothing. She pleaded guilty. There was no trial, and so nothing was ever tested. The judge, in tears, passed the only sentence the law allowed: death. It was commuted, on account of her age at the time of the crime, to life imprisonment. She served 20 years. And here is where the case, which appears to have ended, refuses to end. Because there were people at the time, and there have been people ever since, who did not believe the confession told the whole truth. It was too clean. She confessed to everything and explained almost nothing. The account she gave of how she carried it out did not sit easily with the medical evidence. She was insistent, in a way that struck some observers as strange, that she had acted entirely alone and that her father knew nothing whatever about it. The suspicion that has never gone away is this, that Constance was protecting someone. Perhaps her brother William, with whom she had once run away and to whom she was devoted. Perhaps her father. Perhaps she was simply a young woman who had come, under years of religious instruction, to believe that confession and punishment were the only road left open to her, whatever she had or had not actually done that night. Nobody knows. She was never cross-examined, because she never stood trial, and she never, in the whole of her long life afterward, said one word more about it. Constance Kent served her 20 years, and was released in 1885, at the age of 41. And then she did something remarkable. She vanished. She took a new name, and she emigrated to Australia. And there, under that name, she trained as a nurse. She spent the rest of her working life caring for the sick, in a typhoid outbreak, in a leper colony, in an institution for children. She ran a nurse's home. She was, by every account of those who knew her in that second life, kind, capable, and utterly private. Nobody there had any idea who she was. She died in 1944, in Sydney, at the age of 100. Her brother William became a distinguished marine biologist. Samuel Kent, their father, died in 1872. And Jonathan Wiltshire, the detective who had been laughed out of his profession, lived to see himself vindicated. When Constance confessed in 1865, the newspapers that had destroyed him were obliged to admit that the man they had mocked had been right all along, 5 years earlier, working from nothing but a laundry book and his own reading of a girl's face. He had been correct. It had cost him everything anyway. He worked afterward as a private inquiry agent, quietly, and died in 1881. The Road Hill House murder did something no other Victorian crime did. It got into the bloodstream of English literature. Charles Dickens followed it obsessively and had his own theory about it. Wilkie Collins took its shape: the sealed household, the family under suspicion, the outsider detective picking through the domestic wreckage, and built The Moonstone out of it, a novel often called the first English detective novel. Every locked room mystery, every country house murder, every story in which the guilty party is sitting at the breakfast table descends in some measure from that house in Wiltshire in the summer of 1860. But underneath the literary inheritance, there is a much smaller and sadder thing. There was a 3-year-old boy named Seville who was loved, in a house where love had been divided into 2 unequal halves, and who was taken from his cot in the night by someone who lived under the same roof. Everything else, the detective, the outrage, the confession, the novels, grew out of that. And this is what the case leaves you with: a man who was right and was destroyed for saying so, a woman who confessed to everything and explained nothing, and then spent 60 years being good to strangers on the other side of the world, a family that never spoke of it again, and a door bolted from the inside on a summer night in 1860, which told everyone from the very first morning that the answer was already in the house. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe cases like this one deserve to be remembered, subscribe. The next one is already coming.